Good afternoon. This is Talking Drupal, a bi-weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. Actually, we have a few things in common, but one thing is we do love Drupal. We record this every Wednesday afternoon in a Google Hangout. Visit us at talkingdrupal.com. This is episode 96, Wednesday, June 3rd, and today's show is about external content. Welcome, guys.
Good afternoon.
What's going on, Steve? It's good.
So I had
good
my
to see
first.
That after.
Go ahead. Sorry, John.
I was just going to say that. No, that's right. It's good to see after 1 week off, you're a little rusty on the intro of the show.
Well, I'm rusty on the intro only because we've changed this to be bi-weekly. So I'm not used to saying the bi-weekly. And I did say we record this live every Wednesday afternoon, but it's not every Wednesday afternoon. So anyway. I did miss a show last week, or last time we recorded. It was with the guys from Drupal Easy, Mike and Ryan, and it was a great show. Sorry I missed it. It did pain me slightly the first time in almost 100 shows that I wasn't here, but I'm glad you guys, as I imagined, just handled it properly, and it was a great show. I enjoyed listening to it.
Thanks. Yeah, we definitely felt your absence, but luckily we had some other professional podcasters on to help carry the load.
Yeah, it was good. It was this show is not high pressure. It's a chat, and we do record this bi-weekly, but we do get together weekly. So it's interesting that the weeks that we're not recording, we're planning the next week. So the three of us are getting together on a weekly basis, and I always look forward to this chat. And as usual, we have John Picozzi from Oomph. Welcome, John.
Good afternoon, Internet.
Good afternoon, Internet. And I see you're in your office today by the backdrop behind you.
Yeah, I am working out of our Providence office today. So
John, I know that
coming into you live.
Recently moved, and they had an open house. I think it was last week or the week before. How did that go?
Open house was great. We had a lot of fun and got to show our great new space to a lot of different people, and it was a good time.
Oh, good. Glad things went well. And also joining us, as usual, Nick Laughlin from Enlightened Design in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Looking forward to today's topic, external content. It's something that I think a couple of us have been working on more and more often, and I think will certainly become more the norm once we start working with Drupal 8 sometime in the future. But I definitely think it's current. Should be good.
Hey, Nick, and I was disappointed that I didn't get up to Boston last night for the Boston meetup. So, did you attend, and how did it go?
Yeah, so the monthly Boston Drupal meetup was last night. I try to make it up each month. I missed last month, so I made it a point to go this month. Pretty good turnout. One of the things that the Boston meetup does is it goes around and does a very quick introduction of everybody. So you say, your name, you say where you work and how long you've been doing Drupal for, that kind of thing. And we're going around the room, and somebody in the back says, my name is Richard Stallman, and I don't do too much of Drupal, but I was invited here by a good friend. And I kind of thought he might have been joking, and I looked back, and sure enough, it was Richard Stallman himself. So we had a surprise visit, and he got up and spoke for 10-15 minutes about the Free Software Foundation and the difference between open source and free source. And he's certainly very knowledgeable. Certainly helped kickstart open software and free software. He's got some very strong beliefs about the differences between open source and MIT licensing and GNU licensing and GPL and that kind of stuff. But it was very enlightening. It's a good talk.
It must have been fun to have someone like that just at a meeting like that.
Yeah, I took a picture, tried to get it on Twitter, but for some reason the Galaxy 6 doesn't like to post tweets. I've never successfully done that for my phone, so I might post that later today.
Yeah, I'm not feeling that that's a Galaxy 6 issue, but
Could be the Twitter app. Twitter app is pretty awful.
yeah, it could be a user issue.
I know I certainly am capable of using Twitter, but
Okay, all right.
it certainly could be a user error. I won't completely discount that.
All right. Well, I'm sorry I missed that last night. So, see, maybe someone cool will come next month. We'll
I'll
see.
be there.
Okay,
I
there you
was in
go. There's at
Boston
least one
last-
cool person.
I was in Boston last night, but for a different type of meetup. I was actually at the Red Sox game last night. I was disappointed that I missed the Boston meetup, but you know, I had a buddy in from out of town, and the Red Sox seemed like he's not much into Drupal, so taking him to a meetup wouldn't have been a good time for him.
Was the Red Sox meetup a good time?
Yeah, actually, they won, which was always a plus. And other than it being about 47 degrees, it was a good time.
Yeah, it's cold and rainy last night, right?
No rain. Rain stopped in Boston around between 4 and 5. So there was no rain. It was just cold.
Yeah, 45 degrees is not baseball weather, really.
Well, it's funny because I stopped taking my wife to April baseball because she'd always complain that it was like wet and rainy.
Yeah.
Apparently now I can't take her to early June baseball either.
And August baseball's too hot. So I mean, what are you gonna do, right?
August night games are good, so we'll focus on those. We'll see.
Right. My daughter just left. She's going up to the Red Sox. They have a 1:30 game. She left probably an hour ago. I don't even know who they're playing.
Me either. But that's
they're probably still playing the Twins.
Right. Okay. Well, they have an afternoon game today. So, anyway, let's talk about our
probably.
topic: external content. What do we mean by this? External content.
So I'm sure there's more true definitions on the internet somewhere, but for the purpose of the
we're looking for the talking Drupal definition.
The talking Drupal definition is content that isn't created locally to your website. It may end up being a node or an entity, but content that is created on some third-party service, whether it's a piece of software running on a client server or social media or another Drupal website that is just giving a feed. It's content that is pulled into your website externally and isn't added by somebody in administration.
So for the purposes of this conversation, we're talking about content that comes from somewhere else but is stored in our local Drupal database for this website, right?
Yep.
It's not stuff that we're pulling in from an iframe and that kind of thing. We're pulling this content into our database and then we're serving it as part of our website.
Yep. Most commonly, it's some kind of JSON feed, or an XML feed or something, and you use feeds or REST or something similar to that to pull it in. But it is content that ends up living on your site. It's just not created on your website.
So we have a couple of interesting.
Just to clarify on that point one little bit, we are talking about content. Nick just said this. That's not created on our website, but we are importing two content types in our Drupal site. Is that correct?
Or at least entities. It could be content types or taxonomy or users or some custom entity. But yes.
Sure. Okay. So that I think that's going to be important. An important distinction later on.
And another little important distinction, John, to add on to that is the opportunity to maybe modify or maintain that content once it's here. Is what are the things to think about when you pull that content in? Who's what's the canonical source of that content at that point? Who owns it and who should maintain it? So always an interesting debate. We have some interesting use cases for things like this, and this show is always driven by the projects that we are all working on or have worked on in the past. So the first one, and I think this is the first public announcement I'm making of it because the site only went live a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago, is givethem20.org. And this is a website for a nonprofit that is doing a social media campaign to bring awareness to their mission. Their mission happens to be, and the company is American Corporate Partners. They support veterans who have finished their service to the country and are now trying to get themselves into the working world. And American Corporate Partners helps them do that, transition military people into what we'll call the real world here, or the business world, through primarily mentoring programs, where they'll take veterans and partner them with business people that turn into mentors and get them jobs and help them acclimate themselves. So to smooth out the transition from the military life into civilian life. It's a great company, a great nonprofit, and they're doing a interesting campaign right now called Give Them 20, hashtag Give Them 20, where they're calling up people to salute veterans, to give 20 of something. It could be push-ups, sit-ups, shots of tequila or whatever, and basically bring awareness to this mission that they have. So this campaign that we're working on and the website we built is about social media, and it interfaces with an external source to pull in social media content. So it's really an interesting use case where the Drupal database stores content that serves this website at givethem20.org, but the content, most of the, or 95% of the content, is actually pulled from an external service provider, which is accumulating and curating content from social media. And we'll talk about how that website was built and maybe some of the pieces later in the show. I think we have a couple of other interesting use cases as well.
Steve, that use case right there, that's pulling that information in using Twitter's API, not using the Twitter module for Drupal, correct?
Yeah, so it's actually a little bit more. It's a little bit different than that. So we're not using the Twitter API directly. We're using an API from a third-party vendor. In this case, it's Livefire, that they're accumulating content from Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. They curate that content on their side. That's what they provide as a service, and they give an API to me. So I'm interfacing with their API to pull that content into my site. So I haven't built an interface to Twitter, to Facebook, to Instagram. I'm basically interfacing with them, and they're doing all those other details.
Sure, and that's, I just wanted to clear that up, that you're not using like the Twitter module to pull this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yep. A couple of other examples. One that we've talked about on the show before is the inventory site that I worked with. It's something similar. Their backend, there's a backend piece of software that has a database that users can enter their inventory into, and then using REST, that updates the client's public-facing website. Again, all the content is imported directly, so it can be indexed by Solr and by search engines. But the content is actually controlled elsewhere, so it's controlled behind a firewall, and nobody has access to that except for the interface with the public website. It also makes it very easy to spin up a new instance if needed, but all the content does live on the website.
So Nick, in that example, there's an inventory, I don't know what it's built in. Is it a MySQL or is it a SQL database with a Visual Basic application? Is that what I remember?
I believe it's actually MySQL and PHP. I really don't know. The backend system, right? Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but I just want to make sure that it's clear that, so this is a software package that someone's installed in their business and they're using it to manage their inventory, right? Yeah, that's an important piece, is that someone's using this product they purchased to manage their inventory, do sales, and do all kinds of stuff, and then then you've built an outside website that's sort of sitting on this firewall outside, separated from the business, and it pulls content from inside the business so the customer can have a public website.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yep, and it's actually a push relationship. So the software pushes the content. So it updates. So with a pull, you have to wait until a pull happens. With a push, it updates immediately. So they're able to update something in their backend system, and within 30 seconds, it will be live on their website. But they have all sorts of other information, like customer retention and customer relationship management stuff that the software does that they don't want it to risk exposing ever. So if somebody were to hack the website and get into the website and see all the data, all they're going to see is what's public already.
Exactly.
There's no risk for losing sensitive data or customer data. The only thing on there is what's publicly available.
So one of the differences between the use case that I described and the one you describe is I'm doing a pull. So every 15 minutes, I pull the latest content coming from the social media source, and then I update my website.
Yep.
On your project, you've built the endpoints already in your website. So anytime someone updates to something inside the company, like a product description, it's calling an endpoint on your server for the website, and that content's getting updated real time.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, wow, yeah.
Yep.
So it's the external content in both situations, but it's a little bit different strategy there.
Yep. There's a second project that I'm working on currently that's a little bit different than both of these, in that it's similar to the first project I spoke about, in that there's a back-end piece of software that manages all the content, all the customer data, all that information. And Drupal exists as a framework to manage users and access to particular pieces of functionality. But the content actually never lives in Drupal, and it's not an iframe. It's not like that. It's just we've written a framework to interact with the API of their system in order to pull the data and display it on the page. But it doesn't ever live in the Drupal database. So it's not.
I would just like to be careful how we state that it never, or in instances that data never actually lives in the Drupal database, or that it's not in the Drupal database, because I think that goes back to what I was saying before a little bit. That you will be, if you're pulling this data in some instances you may be creating content types and whatnot. So.
Yep. Yeah, and in this particular case we're not. I mean, the only content type on the site is notifications. Everything else that's being displayed is being pulled through the API and then printed to the page. And it gets pulled every single time. And again, it's more of a security measure. They can't have, some of the data is sensitive customer data, and they can't have it living somewhere outside of the firewall. They're able to display it when somebody's authenticated, but they need it to be taken away once they log out.
So Nick, is that more of a headless Drupal or decoupled Drupal approach that you're taking there?
No, because headless Drupal implies that Drupal is serving the data, and then there's a separate system that's theming and rendering that data. In this case, Drupal is theming and rendering it, but it's just not storing the data locally. Drupal is really only handling authentication and restrictions.
The real question there is there a term for that in the Drupal community, where Drupal's handling the presentation of the data and not so much the curation or the manipulation of the data?
Headed Drupal? Headful Drupal?
Drupal.
Coupled Drupal?
Drupal head, or maybe footless Drupal?
There's a key technology difference between these in terms of, in my first example with Give Them 20 and Nick's inventory example, the connection to the outside system could non-exist and the website still functions and works.
Yep.
In the last example, the one you're talking about right now, the website functioning is dependent on that external source being real-time active.
Exactly.
Right.
That's a very good point.
Which was an important strategy for what we did with Give Them 20, which was the vendor that we worked with did have the ability that we could pull in JSON content real-time, exactly the way you're talking about in this last implementation, but we didn't want to have that dependency, that in
Yeah.
case all failed, that website could run, and if it didn't get a content update for 24 hours, the website would still be delivering content to consumers no matter what.
Yeah, in
And it
general,
really comes
that's
down
the
to
way to go. And for this particular project, they manage both ends of the API, so they're willing to have that dependency.
And it really comes down to also how quickly the data needs to be updated between the systems. So in Steve's instance, a 15 or 20 minute delay in the data appearing on the website isn't really going to be the end of the world. In certain scenarios, we have certain clients in healthcare and government that a delay like that is extremely detrimental, and they need it to be directly pulled in the fashion that Nick's talking about. So it's very situational, it feels to me.
Yeah, it certainly is. And then the final project, which we'll just very briefly mention, is kind of the final piece that we talked about, where you may have multiple Drupal sites and you want to aggregate some of the content on a site. And I have a project I've spoken about a couple times, Innovation Nights, and they have children sites in different cities, and each one every night uploads their content to the master Innovation Night site using feeds and imports it. And we did a show on feeds in the past. I think it was in the 30s. We'll have the number in the show notes. So if you want to know more about that kind of stuff, you can certainly listen to the feeds podcast that we had. So.
All right, so let's talk about. We got trusted. How trusted is the source? I can't remember what we were pointing at here. So help me out. You guys remember what our point here is?
How trusted is the source?
Yeah.
So when you're grabbing external content, it's important to think about how trusted the source is, and what that means is, can you post the information without worrying about what's there? So in your case, with Give Them 20, the source isn't trusted at all. It's social media. It's coming from Facebook. It's coming from Twitter. It's coming from Instagram. So you need to be aware of what happens if somebody starts posting inappropriate or profane content, how to properly sanitize the content, that kind of thing. Where in the inventory or the mysterious project that I'm working on, that content is completely trusted. I mean, they're posting their own stuff, so you don't have to put a language filter on it. You don't have to put a profanity filter on it. You don't need to worry about somebody uploading malicious HTML because it's coming from a trusted source. So when you're pulling, or same thing as the Innovation Nights, where you control both ends of the endpoint, it's really about how if it's coming from the public, or is it coming from somebody that you can trust to curate the content.
Sure. So curation is a big part of pulling public content. We could talk about that a little bit more later, about some curation techniques. But also it's a little bit more than what's trusted here, right? It's also what is the kind of content you're getting. So for an example, one of the issues we ran into, and this really isn't necessarily a trusted issue, but
yeah.
When we pull social media content, we get emoji data, right? So if you think about Facebook and Twitter, emojis which are stored as like double byte kind of content becomes a problem in Drupal, and this show is not going to be about how to deal with that and Unicode issues, but it's about figuring out what your filters are in terms of bringing that content in, which really does lead to curation. So it's what's in the content, and then it's how the content is formatted are two different things you need to think about.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
when you're coming from what we would call the trusted source, these are issues that you completely ignored on your input, right, Nick? Like if someone posted something, like if you take the inventory system in example, someone's putting a product description in there, you're not looking for, you're not running it through like a foul word filter or anything like that to worry about anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely not. And the client's very aware that if one of their employees goes rogue and starts posting emojis and awful, in inappropriate language or they understand that they need to fix that on their side. The good news is, as soon as they hit enter, it's going to push back to the website and update it, and it will be clean. The other thing is the content is on there, so they could log in and delete something immediately from the website and then clean it in the database. So there's other ways. They certainly have tools to curate the content if something like that were to happen, but it's definitely not the norm. Whereas if you're importing something from Twitter, you certainly have to be very careful.
So from on the inventory side, one of the things, because we've put systems together like this in the past, is that we would do something like a product description field internal and then product description field website. Did you do these kinds of things where they had the opportunity to change the language of the content depending on where it was being positioned?
Yes and no. On my end, their internal software was pretty well complete, so we didn't have a whole lot of control.
Right.
But the owner of the software was the person who actually hired me to do the work. So there were a couple of instances where they were able to split things out and modify it. But in general, it wasn't like we built that piece from ground up. I have nothing to do with that piece. So a little bit of yes, a little bit of no.
So for people who have the opportunity to control where the source is coming from, it could be a good idea to, depending on the situation, to give the content editors options to create different content depending on where it's going. So there could be a product description that shows up on an invoice. There could be a product description that shows up on the internal packing system. There could be a description that shows up on the website.
Yep, and that goes back to the COPE principle that NPR has. You create once, publish everywhere. So you have, you set it up so that you can build it easily to maintain all the different systems that you have, and it's certainly something to consider.
Right. So, what kind of challenges would we expect to run into when we're doing integration? Like we talked a little bit, we started to touch on what's the canonical source of this content, and sometimes there is none. So in my case, for the project that I presented with Give Them 20, we're pulling in social media content from a source. We certainly, once it's in our database, we've provided tools for an admin to maintain that content if they needed to. And we're never pushing back that clearly back up to social media. But what are the kind of things that we need to think about in this area? Is it a one-way stream of content, or is it a both? And how do you manage those? How do you manage that content after that point if you're maintaining on both sides?
So the next two topics we're going to cover here, pushing, pulling, and both, as well as curation, go kind of hand in hand depending on what strategy you're going with. Steve, your example is clearly a pull example where there is no pushing, there is no updating, none of that.
No, there is updating. There is updating, but it's not going back.
Right.
So,
okay,
yeah.
So they're updating it locally within the Drupal installation, as opposed to you through your fire hose. I've always worked. I predominantly try to work in the early phases of a project into what is the method to which this content's going to be updated, and then you also have to think about where that content's going to be updated. What is that canonical source? And I think that planning early is definitely a necessity for that to be successful, because there is always that gotcha when you get to the end that they're like, oh, we need to be able to update this. Well, where does that update happen, and how does the information sharing go? So I think that's definitely a complicated problem to have.
And sometimes it's perfectly clear, and sometimes it's not. So, for example, in the inventory site, it's very clear. It's a one-way push. The canonical source is the internal database. If they need to make a change, that's where they make it. And that's all there is to it. Sometimes it's a little less clear. Like to give them 20, initially you look at it and you say that the canonical source is the social media, but it's really not, because what happens is it pulls the social media, puts it in, and then if somebody from the nonprofit makes a change to that piece of content, it doesn't go back, but it also doesn't update on the next pull. Similarly, if somebody were to edit their tweet after it's been pulled in, it's not going to be updated. So in your case, the canonical original source is social media. Well, once there's been a change, there is no canonical source. It's just the website. The website becomes the canonical source for the website. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's exactly right. And there is certainly a reality to that. Certainly, in the beginning of a campaign like this, there's a lot of focus on trying to make the first page of. And if you haven't looked at the website, it's basically a grid of posts that is, depending on your browser size, could be 4 columns, 4 boxes across by hundreds deep. But there's a strategy to making that first page, managing that first page content. So while that page appears to be all the most recent content that's coming in, it's actually not. There's some strategy in terms of making the most important pieces of social media that are out there sticky to certain points in the page, and we've got some strategies to do that. But also, it's when you pull that content in, sometimes you may want to modify it slightly, which seems a little bit strange, but you might want to remove an F word because the post is great. You just don't want the F word showing up on your site. So you have the option to do that.
So, Steve, I have a question, and this is not, well, I don't know, maybe it does have a little bit to do with the topic, but is there some sort of intellectual property or some sort of concern there that the maintainers of this website are actually editing people's words? So what I mean by that is, I say something very deliberately on Twitter, and then I use the F-bomb because maybe I'm trying to be uber colorful, and then the creators of this website edit it out and potentially change my intent or meaning. Is there a concern there, or
sure.
How is that?
So if I've presented this, maybe I've prevented this, like the content, the owner of the website is changing all this content. They're not. The option is there to do it. They have disabled posts that they haven't preferred to see, as opposed to changing the content. The ones that they've changed the content on, and we've done it in a few cases, is that in a situation where someone that they know has posted something, and there could be a simple typo, or like the name is not clear. So when you pull stuff from social media, sometimes through this fire hose, the source of the content is not clear. So, like, there was some posts today from the Today Show. The name that comes through the feed could come through not as the Today Show, but it's something slightly different, and I'm just using this as an example. So it could be a situation where we just go in and modify that field that shows where the post came from to say the Today Show, as opposed to some other text that wasn't clear of where that came from. So this is not a situation where we're doing editorial work on people's posts. But the point is that in terms of dealing with external content, is that because we've pulled it in, we now have that content on our website and have the capability to do that. Whether you should or should not is not really our point today, but is really you have the capability to do that, and it might make sense in some circumstances to do it. Maybe not with social media, but maybe with an inventory management system. In like Nick's situation where he's doing a push, but what if it was a pull and there was a typo in a product description that you could go into the website side and modify it?
Yeah.
And not necessarily whether you should or shouldn't from an ethical point of view, but the capability that you can.
Yeah, and we could certainly set up the inventory system where it's two ways.
Right.
Where it will pull from the system, but then if you update the website, it will then push that change back and do a patch or a post or something. So it's really we're talking about possibility today, not right or wrong and morality. Although depending on the mission of your client, it's certainly something to consider whether or not they should have the ability to make changes or not. And in most cases, you'll find that it makes everyone's life easier and more simple if you have a canonical source, it's coming from one point and going one way. Once you start adding two-way communication, you have the ability to set up race conditions and things that go haywire. For example, if you have some kind of script that changes profanity on your website but not on the other site, and so it gets imported and it sees the profanity, so it makes a change and then sends that back, and then you have some script on the other site that changes it back. You could very easily end up in an infinite loop of content going back and forth. So it's important to, or they could just get out of sync. It may just be completely out of sync, even if it isn't an infinite loop. So there's a lot. It's a difficult problem to import stuff from external sources, but if you're updating both ways, it becomes much more than twice as difficult usually.
So related to John's question about like what if there's an F word in there, I think curation is an important part of pulling content, certainly from a non-trusted source maybe is where this is more prevalent, but the partner that we chose, Livefire, to pull in the social media content, and there's a lot of vendors out there that provide this kind of capability. One of the things that they have on their end is they do have a profanity filter, so as they're pulling everything in from a hashtag of give them 20, they're running it through a profanity filter, and then those items show up on their side as not approved or spam or some other tag they stick on it, and they never end up in the API for me. So from my end, I'm pulling from an API. Then I have a tool that I can go look at the content that they actually pulled in, and they've curated a little bit, and they have an extensive number of filters you can apply for curation. I think we're just using profanity filter in those items, and I think we're using duplicate filter too. So in case something gets posted on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and 10 other things at one time, we don't end up with 10 things in our feed. It just gives us one or two. So those kinds of curation filters sit on their end with the product that I'm using, and they get marked as spam or unapproved, and we could approve them, and then they would show up in the next pull that we do from the API. But
Steve, just out of curiosity,
yeah.
how does the profanity filter work? Does it still give you access to that content, or does it just remove it from the feed?
No, it flags it, so it's all there. And so
Gotcha.
the way this particular tool works is they have their own default list of profanity that they're searching for in the content. I could add to that or update my own list. I've just used their default. It hasn't been a problem yet in this campaign. So it hasn't been a big deal. It marks it, and it marks it, and then someone can go through and say, "Hey, let me see all the things that have been marked as not approved, what the reason is," and they could go ahead and approve them. So, and we had originally thought that we'd put this on the Drupal side and actually worked on that. It turned out that we selected a partner that had a filter like that, so we didn't need to do it on the Drupal end, but you could do it there as well. There's some modules that you can use that would help you filter this kind of content and flag content with profanity words. I don't remember what they are off the top of my head, but I looked at them probably 6 months ago. So there's ways to do this yourself on the Drupal side. And Drupal is from my perspective, and I think that the project that Nick has talked about, other than the real-time JSON feed, is that Drupal is playing the role of a curation tool to some degree, that you can go, and my customer is doing this. Like Jimmy Kimmel did a post and got involved in this campaign a couple of days ago, and there were like 30 items that were based on Jimmy Kimmel shortly after he posted it. And they made it all the way through the API onto our website. So they went in to our side and just looked at those content blocks and unpublished those pieces of content. So when you came to the website, it wasn't 2 pages of Jimmy Kimmel, which is what happens in social media when these little bursts of activity happen. You start to get, a lot of stuff for one particular topic, and Drupal is a great way to go in and do that. And from a user admin perspective, it's so simple in Drupal. Like we've built, they can look at the home page or the content page, and they get these little edit buttons right on the piece of content. They can click it and then say unpublish. So it's really easy. Drupal is a great way to maintain and maintain that kind of content in a curation fashion.
Yeah, and I mean, not that it necessarily is a good fit for this particular project. Maybe it is, but you could even set it up to just be a flag where there's a button that shows up that they click that unpublishes it, so they don't even have to worry about hitting edit, unpublish, and save. Right. So yeah, so in a lot of these cases, you're using Drupal as a framework to curate and manage content, as well as things like search engine optimization and responsive themes, and you're using Drupal as a tool to manage that kind of stuff, but it's not the source of your content. And I think, I think that larger projects and people, that's one of the reasons why Drupal's become very useful in enterprise environments, is that Drupal is prone to very strong content modeling and makes this kind of process simple and possible. Simple considering the alternative, which is build it from the ground up or use another framework. So I think that there's another thing that you did which is pretty particularly interesting, and that would be the calls to action, which is a little bit different, a different spin on this.
Yeah. So the idea of this website is that we pull in social media content real time or every 15 minutes, and we display it on the homepage. So there's 4 blocks across. You get these little squares. So you see people tweeting and Facebook and YouTube and whatever flowing down the page. But a customer would want to have control over, and I mentioned this a little earlier, over maybe what shows up in those primary boxes. So what we did was and this is like perfect for Drupal, we're pulling this content in from the outside and we're displaying it on the website. But you know what? Let's take the first 20 boxes. We want every other box to be controlled for a marketing perspective. That the most important piece of social media going on at the time could be that post by Jimmy Kimmel or something by some other celebrity or the New York Mets. We want to make sure those show up in the top 10 boxes. So every other box in the first 20 on the page, the customer has the ability to pick the piece of content that shows up in it. And in addition to that, some of those could be calls to action for their campaign. So if you go to the website, you'll see box 7, what we call box 7 is a call to action. And then box like 19 is a call to action, and then every 15th box after that is a call to action, which is, things people can do. They can donate money. It tells them more about what the program is about. So that was one of the reasons why we didn't use an external source to just use their iframe or use their JSON technology to pull this content in. We actually wanted to have more control over the first 20 boxes that show up and then every 14th box after that. And the only way to do that is to pull that content into our database and manage it. And Drupal was just a great way to do that. Once the content was in there, I mean, it's basic Drupal skills kind of to do the things that we're doing to build these pages. Well, that might not be completely true. I mean, there's some crazy Ajax stuff going on here. It's one of those websites where it's an endless bottom of a page, so every time you scroll down 75%, it loads the next set of content. So not necessarily straightforward stuff, but I mean, in terms of the Drupal side, it's really served its purpose well.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a pretty fascinating project technically, and Drupal is really a good fit for that.
You know, and the other thing here is that the editing workflow for this is that Facebook is a real challenge in this project for social media, because if you post something on Facebook and make it you share it, it doesn't mean that a public API can actually grab it. Although people can publicly see it if they know what the URL is, you can't grab it from a Facebook API. So we ended up having to build in, which is, again, perfect for Drupal in terms of content curation. It's not just editing content, but create new content. So people have the ability on the admin side, if they see a great Facebook post that's been shared but does not come through the API feed, that they can add it to the website. And so when you're thinking about pulling in external content, you can always provide additional services to add content to the website through the Drupal admin tools.
Yeah, and to give a clear example of why that would happen is the API the service is pulling stuff in from the hashtag, give them 20.
Right.
So if somebody were to just write a Facebook post and say, I'm giving 20, here's the video, it doesn't have the hashtag, so it's not going to show up. And then, but if it's by somebody that's famous or popular, or it's just a really interesting take on giving 20, then the team can pull that in.
Yeah, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that with the API in Facebook, but we don't need to talk about that right now. So API, Facebook is very picky in terms of what you can get publicly, which is why you generally don't see anything in Facebook outside in the world unless you're in Facebook.
Yeah.
So they're very protective of their content. So there's a few struggles there, but the point is that you see any URL, which it could be a Vimeo. Someone maybe might post a Vimeo video. They might post something on Tumblr. They might post something on YouTube. And through the Drupal side, just give someone the ability to add new content and point to that link. As long as you can get to that link and embed a video or a piece of text, you can provide supportive services for that external content that you're trying to pull in, which is exactly what we're doing for this campaign.
Very cool.
So the feeds that we're pulling in from Livefire is a JSON feed. There are other sources of content that you can pull in. Nick, John, what are the kinds of feed types that you guys have imported into your projects? And just on the JSON side, we just wrote some simple PHP code directly. We didn't use the feed module. We just we created a custom module and just wrote some pretty straightforward PHP code to manage the JSON feed coming for this project.
Yeah, so the two main, I guess, file formats that are used for this kind of thing are XML and JSON. Right. The three main techniques, or the three main ways that you can consume that in Drupal. One, probably the most commonly used, is feeds. Feeds works with RSS feeds, XML. I think it can work with JSON. It works with CSVs. It works with a whole host of things that are available to an admin. You can also use REST, and you can also use SOAP. REST and SOAP are fairly similar, fairly interchangeable protocols for handling, updating, and creating and deleting content. I personally haven't really used SOAP. I focus more on REST. I think I think SOAP is a little bit older than REST, but I'm certainly
So
not.
SOAP is the protocol that's using XML. REST is a protocol that's using JSON, pretty much, right?
There's probably more technicalities to that, but I'll say
Okay. All right.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. More that's
Um,
over my head too, but.
I think that they also handle different headers as well. So I think that REST uses things like get, post, patch, delete. I think SOAP can use different allows you to define your own. I know REST allows you to define your own headers as well, but I think SOAP defines them a little bit differently. Um, again, I've looked at using SOAP a couple times, but I've always just gone back to REST, both because it's what I'm familiar with, and it seems to have a wider adoption, at least currently. So those are the three ways generally you look at getting content in using. You use the feeds module with Drupal. You can use REST WS, or you can use services. Services works with both REST and SOAP, but it really just depends. It really depends a lot on the source content. If the source is giving you something with JSON, then you can use. You're probably going to use REST. If it's giving you something else, you're probably going to use SOAP.
What about feeds examples? Does anyone have any examples where they use feeds on a regular basis to pull content into their Drupal site?
Yeah, I'm sure John does too.
Yeah, I definitely do. A lot of times, actually, most recently, I actually used a feed, and this is more of a migration example, I guess, than a continual data source example, but pulling out of WordPress. So, if for some reason you had, real world example for this could be as simple as, our corporate blog is built in WordPress and our corporate website, for whatever reason, is built in Drupal. They need to share information. The feeds module has a WordPress importer or WordPress feed that it can actually go out to your WordPress site and pull in certain pieces of content based on parameters that you set. I'm actually right now working on an integration with feeds from a Oracle service for job postings. So the company that we're working with has this service they're using to post their jobs to job boards and so on and so forth, and manage applications. And they actually want to be able to feed that content in real time into their website so people can see the job listings on their website.
John, is it an RSS feed?
Yet to be determined.
Okay.
Yeah, it's yet to be determined. We're looking for XML or maybe even a JSON feed. Really depends on what the service offers. XML is usually kind of the de facto standard there. And then ideally what we'd like to be able to do is pull them into the site and then give them the ability to not so much curate them on the site, still use the service to do that, but basically be able to update based on if that job has been filled or not, and so on and so forth.
One of the things I want to point out, and this is a little bit slightly off topic right now, but is the value of pulling the content into your database as opposed to like just pulling it in real time through a JSON feed and not having the content exist, is that you lose a lot of SEO. And that was one of the reasons we did this too. I forgot to mention earlier, for the Give Them 20. And for other projects, as John is mentioning this RSS feed, is that we have another website that we built that's around a benefit program where members of this benefit program get access to special offers. There's a good percentage of those special offers that come from an external source, like movie tickets, theme park ride tickets, discounts at Target. The company doesn't provide that themselves, but they get it from an outside source. We import them through an RSS feed, and we display that content on this website. The reason for us to do that is so there's SEO benefit for that content being physically on our website. So when Google indexes the site, they see the offer on our website as opposed to an iframe that was pulling the content in from that external source. That's never going to get indexed as related to your website. So if you can pull the content in and own it, there's a great benefit when you're interfacing with external parties. A little bit off topic, but I just want to mention that.
It also goes back to the whole relying on a external source for your data issue. I think I want to mention that again because we all know that websites have problems, the internet has problems. If that source is not available to you, that your website's essentially broken if you're relying on it at load time. So I think it's plus the ability to be able to not depend on that source 100% to load your site is definitely worthwhile. Again, there is the time, the information latency issue. It could be a concern for you, but you just have to weigh your factors.
Right.
Yeah. So information latency is definitely one of the key things you need to think about. That's if you need to have the information latency really low, generally a push is the way to go. Push from the source to the destination, because as soon as the source is updated, it can push it. If you're doing a poll, it can sometimes have performance implications, so you don't want to do it every minute. So it becomes a balancing act to determine when the best time to do a poll is and how often you should do a poll. There's other hybrids where you can have the system do a quick push to say, hey, it's time to do a poll. But then but there's certainly different ways to solve that problem.
All right. I think we've exhausted some of the things we wanted to say about external sources. It's something that has become very prominent in our business practices. So if you have questions about external sources or any of the projects or technologies we've talked about today, reach out to us at talkingdrupal@gmail.com and we can answer them in future shows or answer them before that. Let's move on to our module of the week, which is JPlayer.
So this is a module that I suggested. JPlayer is a module that helps you integrate the JPlayer library. The JPlayer library is a way to take a file on your website, whether it's a video or audio, and serve it in a nice way to mobile devices with a Flash fallback if somebody doesn't have JavaScript enabled. It is pretty easy to use. It's pretty similar to the HTML5 media module, except it uses the external library. And this particular client was using JPlayer elsewhere on their previous site and wanted to stick with it because they were familiar with it. And I found it pretty straightforward to set up and install and get working. The only caveat I found is that the latest version of JPlayer changed the way that it displays the version number. So the module's regex to determine what version, whether or not JPlayer is installed, didn't quite work. So I had to modify one file in the JPlayer library to display the version number correctly. Other than that, it was great.
Nick, you may have said this, and I might have missed it. So if you don't have JavaScript, it has a Flash fallback. What happens if you don't have JavaScript or Flash?
Then what are you doing on the internet? I'm just kidding. It just doesn't work.
All right.
It just doesn't work.
So there's no HTML5 kind of like integration there?
It may have that. I think I may have worked that in manually. I don't recall.
Okay.
I'd have to look at it again.
Okay.
All right. Hey guys, so we're at the end of episode 96, external content. So a few things we want to make you aware of. The New England Drupal camp is scheduled for October 10th in Providence, Rhode Island. If you are interested in coming, get your tickets now. If you're interested in presenting, you have till July 1st to do that. And if you haven't been to Providence or New England, it's a great opportunity to do that. It's a long weekend. That is Columbus Day weekend. We have some great hotel rates. I think like $150 a night at the downtown Marriott, which is a great discount. So if you're interested to come visit Rhode Island, that'd be a great weekend to do it in the fall. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of activities. So take your whole family. Don't make it a Drupal weekend. Make it a family weekend. And just spend one day with us fine Drupal folks. We also have a local Providence Drupal meetup on June 9th. That's at Oomph. You can find us. The best way to, John, what's the best way to get information on that? I think it's to join Meetup, right?
Yeah, join the meetup.com group. You can also go to drupalpvd.org. There's a link to the meetup group. There's an update on the location and the event date there. So you can find all that out there. You can also follow us on Twitter at DrupalPVD.
Great. I'm looking forward to that one. So I think in that week you're going to do a recap of your experience at DrupalCon.
Yeah, so that's going to be a busy day for me as far as that presentation goes. I'll be actually presenting to our team a recap of DrupalCon rather in the afternoon, and then at night I will be doing it all over again to the Drupal PVD crowd. So it should be a good time.
Yeah, and in this Drupal meetup in Providence, we have this lightning format, so anyone can talk. You just let us know that you want to speak for a few minutes, and you can get up and tell about something, ask a question. It's a great format and a good environment. A lot of supporting people there to help you out. So please join and visit us if you're anywhere in the Providence or Boston area. So also two other things I want to mention before we close out. One is if you have any questions that you'd like us to answer on the show or any show topic ideas, please email us at talkingdrupal@gmail.com. And you could always go to iTunes and give us a review there. We love to see those. They always come through really good too, so it's really exciting when they come in. So thanks everyone who's done that in the past, and keep them coming. So John Picozzi from Oomph, where can people find you and reach out to if they want to engage with you in some way?
They can engage with me again at Drupal PVD next week. If you want to get in touch with me earlier than that, you can find me on all the social networks at John Picozzi, or always on at oomphinc.com.
Great. How about you, Nick?
You can find me online at Nixvan, N-I-C-X-V-A-N, pretty much everywhere, and at enlighten.net. There's no E in the beginning.
Great. And I'm Stephen Cross, at Stephen Cross, or parallaxinfotech.com. And we are only 1 minute after our deadline to close today's show, guys. So thank you for your time, and we'll talk next week.
Have a good one.
See ya.
Next week.